All right, good morning, everyone. Good to be with you all today. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here, and it is good to be with you all this morning. I'd like to open up with a word of prayer today, if we could. So if you pray with me. Father, thank you so much for the gift it is to be here today, to be a part of this community. I know that it's been such a gift to be able to gather together, to get to know so many of the brothers and sisters in this room, the community, get to hear the stories of the ways that you've worked in the lives of so many people in this room. It really has been such a gift to get to play a role within this community that you have shaped, that you have brought together, and to be a part of it even to this day. And so all that to say, I just ask, Father, that as we look into your word this morning, that you would point our hearts towards you, that you would lift our eyes to you, and you would remind us of where our hope comes from, where our courage comes from, and where our help comes from. All right, that we look to you first and foremost. And you have been remarkably faithful to us as a church, and we know that that is something that you will continue to do. And so with that, we thank you. We give you praise for your faithfulness. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right. Now, I want to open up with a quote from a magician. So this is it. Hobbies are great distractions from the worries and troubles that plague daily living. Hobbies are great distractions from the worries and troubles that plague daily living. One of the things I was thinking about in connection with this line is that if you rewind the tapes to about 2 years ago, beginning of the pandemic, March 2020, kind of everything's shutting down. People are transitioning into remote work if they can. Commute times are cut. And so all of a sudden, there's kind of this additional free time that everyone has. And at the same time, the worries and troubles that plague daily living have been dramatically increased. And I don't know about you, but one of the themes that I feel like I was seeing happening all around me in that time was everyone I knew was picking up new hobbies. Right? Almost everyone was picking up a brand new hobby. And so if we could do this, maybe just a little social experiment, would you throw your hand up if at some point in the first 3 to 6 months you picked up a new hobby in the middle of the pandemic? Anybody? Quite a few. Okay. Me too. I was listening to a biography by Walt Disney, got inspired to become an artist, and it lasted about 3.5 weeks. Before I realized that wasn't going to work. But with that, so of all the hobbies in the room, pandemic or not pandemic related, do we have any cross stitchers? That's what I'm curious about today. Any cross stitchers? We got a couple. See a couple? Okay, that's very good, very good. All right. I mentioned that because in prepping for this message, kind of wrestling with the passage and studying it, I was reminded of a story that I heard once, actually in a sermon at Park. And the story has to do with cross-stitching. The story goes like this. There was a boy and his mother where every Sunday afternoon, they would kind of spend the afternoon doing the same thing every week, where every Sunday afternoon, the boy would take his toys and kind of sit in the middle of the living room floor and just play with his toys. He'd kind of chug his trains along, and he'd build up his blocks and crash them back down and spend the afternoon playing, while his mother would sit in her rocking chair and she would cross-stitch. And they would each have their own things that they were doing, and they would kind of spend each Sunday afternoon in that same way. And every afternoon, at a certain point, the boy would look up from his toys at his mom, and he would see her cross-stitching away, and he'd see the different stitches that she was making on the backside of the project, and see a loose thread here and a loose thread there. But to him, it just looked like a mess. It just looked like chaos, because he couldn't see how all the stitches were working together. They were crossing over each other, and there was different colors, and the whole thing just looked like a mess. Right? The whole thing just looked like chaos, because from his perspective, he couldn't see what she was making. All right, today we're continuing our series through the book of Daniel and picking it up with a story that has its own quantity of chaos, its own amount of mess. And I know for a lot of us, it's a story that's very familiar. Because it's one of the most popular stories, not just in the book of Daniel, but really in the entirety of the Bible, the story of Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. and the fiery furnace. And if you're not familiar with it, no worries. We'll jump into it in quite a bit of detail in a moment. But for those of us who are, I think it's a story that can have a tendency to kind of lose its punch with us, to lose a little bit of the zest with it, because we know the story so well. We know exactly what happens. Each turn along the way, we know how it ends. And so we're not surprised as we're reading it. But if we slow down a little bit and actually take some time with the details and insert ourselves into the story itself, I think what we find is that in its actual lived experience, this story must have been absolutely terrifying, right? And to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's three friends, it must have felt overwhelming. It must have felt scary, must have been overwhelmed by fear. And in the midst of everything, it probably just felt like chaos. And yet I believe what we see as we work through Daniel chapter 3, I believe what we'll see is that even in the midst of all of the chaos and the fear and the uncertainty that they were experiencing, God was with them and God was bringing about something wonderful. And so if I could break the passage down into just one single thought for us this morning, I would phrase it like this, that in the midst of the chaos, God is making something beautiful. In the midst of the chaos, God is making something beautiful. All right, and so we're going to work through the passage together and look at that. And so to that end, if you have a Bible, would you go ahead and open up to Daniel chapter 3? If you don't have one, if you'd like one though, you should be able to find one underneath the seat in front of you if you're down on the ground, or underneath the seat that you are currently in if you're back in the stadium seating. But Daniel chapter 3 is what we're going to be working through together this morning as we explore that idea that in the midst of the chaos, God is making something beautiful. So Daniel chapter 3, and we do have a table of contents just to give some structure. We've got these 3 points: a king's insecurity, a fiery consequence, and a demanding fear. A king's insecurity, a fiery consequence, and a demanding fear. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into that first one now, a king's insecurity. And just setting a little bit of context as we're jumping in. So King Nebuchadnezzar is the king reigning over the entirety of the Babylonian Empire in the beginning of the book of Daniel, right? And we learn quite a bit about Nebuchadnezzar in chapters 2 and 3. And there's some things that happen in chapter 2 that really play into chapter 3 pretty significantly. And what we find more than anything else is that King Nebuchadnezzar is a very insecure king. Right? That fear is a primary motivator driving his actions. And this is how we see it, right? In the beginning of chapter 2, he has this dream. And it goes on to be a very unsettling and a very disturbing dream for him. Because he believes the dream has bad news for him. And so he goes on to give this command to all of his magicians, all of his wise men, all the enchanters. He tells all of them that you need to give me the interpretation of my dream, and you also need to tell me what my dream was. I'm not going to tell you the details. I'm not going to explain to you what actually happened in my dream. You need to somehow figure that out and interpret the dream, right? Which is a ridiculous command. And he says if they're not able to do it, he's going to kill all of them, right? He's going to slaughter every single one of them, which at first doesn't make any sense until you realize that he's coming from a place of insecurity. He thinks his throne is at threat. Right, that there's someone trying to overthrow him, to remove him from his throne. And so he's doing everything he can to protect himself. So he doesn't trust any of them. That's why he makes such a ridiculous command. And then we see through chapter 2 that God goes on to reveal not just the interpretation, but also the dream itself to Daniel. And Daniel then brings that to the king. And then the king receives it and he promotes Daniel and honors him. But the thing that we see is the dream actually meant what King Nebuchadnezzar feared it was going to mean. The message being that your kingdom will not last forever, but it will be replaced by another human kingdom, which will be replaced by another human kingdom, which will be replaced by another human kingdom. And so more than anything, the dream's interpretation actually goes on to confirm his fears and confirm his insecurities. And so if he was a little bit of a mess at the beginning of chapter 2, he is even more of one at the beginning of chapter 3. And that plays directly into everything he does in chapter 3. So what we see here at the very beginning is he actually goes on to lay a trap. right? For all of the officials, for anyone really with any scrap of authority at all within the Babylonian Empire. In chapter 3, at the very beginning, he is setting a trap to weed out anyone who would be willing to go against him. And this is how he does it. Let's jump into this together now. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. So a cubit is 1.5 feet. You just take it, multiply it by 1.5. So this image is 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. I had to use a calculator. I went to Bible college. I hope you won't hold that against me. I really didn't. I want you to know that I really didn't, but I'm kidding. It's just my own mathematical insecurities with Bible college. It'll do that to you. You ask around. Okay, so it's a big image. That's the point. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. All right, so he has this massive statue built, and he sets it up in the midst of this plain, right? This broad, open, flat space where there is very good visibility. All right, now that's actually not typical. If you were going to build a statue like this and have it dedicated and set up anywhere, you would expect it to be in or around a temple, somewhere near a place of worship like that. And yet, he has it set up specifically in the midst of this broad, wide field that's flat where you can see everything. And then he invites every person within the entire Babylonian Empire that has any scrap of authority at all to the dedication of this image because he's setting a trap. And once they're all gathered together in this plain and they're here for the dedication of this image and they're all gathered together, finally, he reveals what they're there for. And this is what he says, verse 4. Or the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. You will be burned alive." And about 10 seconds later, I imagine, all of the instruments blast. And every single person who's gathered there together, they're faced with the immediate choice, right? With these details that probably were not included on the invitation. That you either bow down and worship this image, pledging your loyalty and your allegiance to the king, or if you've got an issue, if you've got a problem, you can choose to not bow down. You can choose to remain standing as everyone else around you bows. But just know what the consequence will be, right? That we will see you plain and clear, and we will gather you, and you will be burned alive immediately. And so the music blasts, and everyone bows down. All right, that's what we see, verse 7. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of every one of these instruments, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. All right, which was probably a good stroke to the fragile ego of this insecure king as he sees every single person in this huge plain bowing down, pledging their allegiance to him. And yet, little did he know what trouble his plan would go on to cause him. Because while everyone who was in the plain did bow down, there were a few who were not. And they go on to cause a little bit of a stir and a little bit of a commotion for him. And so as the plot thickens here, let's jump into our second point to continue to trace this story. So second point now, a fiery consequence. A fiery consequence. Let's pick this up together at verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. Right, they maliciously accused the Jews. What we go on to see is that the accusation is specifically against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and that they're not bowing down to this image, that they haven't done this. Now, I think what's important to take note of is that there's a motivation behind this accusation. It's malicious, and I would bet that the motivation is primarily jealousy. Right? That Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with Daniel, are serving in these positions of influence. They're being well cared for. They're being taken care of, even in exile. And these Chaldeans are probably looking at this saying, like, why are they serving over and above us? This is our hometown. This is our culture. We should be in those spots. Right? They don't deserve to be in these roles. And so when this command comes forward, they see an opportunity to finally take them down. And so maliciously, they bring forward these accusations against them. And this is what they say, looking at verse 9. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." That's the decree. Well, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are their names. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. All right. And so, jealousy is the motivation of their accusation, their malicious accusation. But at the same time, we see that their accusations aren't incorrect. Right? They're not false. They're not coming out of nowhere, but they really did not bow down to this image. Because for them, it actually would have been damaging to their relationship with God. It would have been breaking the second commandment, right? That we see this in Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 and 5, the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had bowed down to the statue, then they would have been breaking the second commandment, dishonoring God, and damaging their relationship with him. All right. Now, it seems that they had some inclination, some inkling of what was actually going to be entailed within this dedication, that they knew that it was going to be more than just a simple dedication. And so they managed somehow to just subtly avoid the whole thing. But now their names have been brought forth. They've been called out. Accusations have been brought against them. And all of a sudden, there is no way to subtly avoid this anymore. And so this is what happens. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up after everything I've done for you, after the ways that I've taken care of you? Is it true that you're not doing this? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of every one of these instruments, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. I will burn you alive. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Right, in essence, what he's saying to them is, you are a plaything given for my own performance. Right? You're a plaything in my hands. You are my puppet. And if you refuse to dance in exactly the way that I tell you to, I'll just get rid of you. Right? And there's nothing that anyone can do to stop me. And so, what's it going to be? That's the question he poses to them. And this is their response. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not," meaning even if he doesn't, "be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. We will never bow down." All right, now, what's interesting is, again, this story is familiar to so many of us. And so because of that, it can kind of lose a little bit of its punch. But if you just slow down at this point and kind of insert yourself into their shoes, I think what you see is, right, that they've got a sense that somehow this dedication is going to involve more than what it seems to. So they avoid it. They probably hear the news afterwards and are glad that they avoided it, and they think that they dodged a bullet here. And yet, then these accusations are brought forward. Right? Likely soldiers come to get them. They drag them in before the king, who is in a furious rage and demands that they either bow down and worship this image, or he will burn them alive immediately. And it will be painful, right? It will hurt, and their lives will be over. And there's nothing anyone else can do about it. Right? If you insert yourself into that situation, you can imagine the kind of fear that they would be feeling, right? A fear that demands to be listened to. That's a fear that demands to be paid attention to. That's a fear that demands to be obeyed. And I think in that situation, what fear pretty clearly demands is that you just bow down. Right, just do what the king is asking. Sure, you're breaking the commandment and it's dishonoring to God and there's some consequences. It'll damage your relationship with him, but just bow down. Right? Don't risk your life over this. Don't throw your life away over this. Just bow down and everything will be okay. And yet we see that their response, even in the midst of a fear like that, is to still honor God. And afterwards, this is what happens. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which, just taking note, in verse 13, it says he was already in a furious rage. And so if the expression of his face was changed against them, how much more upset did he get, right? He is livid off the charts right here. And he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, likely to show them just how out of control, how vulnerable they are, that even on the way to their death, they are completely bound and out of control. So he ordered them to bind them and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Right? And just like that, their story comes to a quick and sudden close. And then there's a couple other details that are included here. In verse 22, because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, meaning the fire was so hot that it killed even the men who approached the door. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. All right, and that is the end of the story. Or at least it would have been, right, in any other case. And yet we see here, right, that in the midst of overwhelming fear and uncertainty and chaos, that God was bringing about something wonderful. Right, that even in the midst of the chaos, God was making something beautiful. And this is what happens. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste because he sees something that surprises him, something that shocks him. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" And they answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt," meaning somehow the ropes that bound them have burned away, and yet they're fine. They're standing up and walking around. Their clothing isn't on fire. Their skin isn't melting. They're not crying out in pain. They're not screaming in anguish. They are fine. And there are 4 of them. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Right, meaning there's something about him that is holy, something different. There is something glorious about the 4th man in the fire. And what we see was even in the midst of the fire, right, God was with them. And I find it kind of fascinating that God could have stepped in any other way in the midst of this story. He didn't have to let them get thrown into the fire itself. And yet, I think just to demonstrate a point, maybe with a little bit of flair and a little bit of style, God let them actually get tossed into the fire itself, just to demonstrate the extent to which God was with them even in the midst of the chaos. And then this is what happens. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Right now, notice that's on the lips of a pagan king, Most High God. That's him acknowledging that their God is the God who is above every other God. And it goes on to say then, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. They walked out of the furnace. They stepped out from the midst of the flames. And now notice who's there to witness it. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Meaning, the fire hadn't touched them at all. They walk out of this furnace and their clothing isn't burned, their hair isn't singed, their skin isn't melted, they don't even smell like smoke. And all of a sudden, all of the people that the king has gathered together throughout the entirety of the Roman Empire to come and bow down and pledge their allegiance to him are there to witness what the one true God can really do. And even the king himself goes on to say this. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command, meaning my command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon, likely much to the chagrin of their former malicious accusers. And so we see from start to finish, the chapter opens with this anxious and insecure king gathering everyone together, orchestrating this plot in order to get everyone with any scrap of authority whatsoever in the entire Babylonian Empire to bow down to his image and pledge allegiance to him. And yet, the chapter ends with he himself witnessing and making a decree, right? And all of those people that he gathered together coming to witness who the one true God really is. And so we see that even in the midst of the chaos, God was making something beautiful. Now, let's jump into our third and final point. And I want to pull some things out of this story in particular and just spend a little bit more time with them that I think will be especially beneficial for us. So with that, a demanding fear. A demanding fear. I think what we see at play in this story more than just about anything else is this fear that demands. Right? And we see it happening with a few different characters. With King Nebuchadnezzar at the very beginning, right? It's his fear, it's his insecurity about his throne that leads him to concoct this plot to gather everyone together. And it's even why he's so upset with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because he's terrified someone is going to try and overthrow him. Right? And so fear is the driving motivation throughout the entirety of this chapter for him. And so we see it at play with the king, but we also see it with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that with them, they find themselves pitted between two different choices. Somehow they recognize this dedication is more than what it has been marketed to be. They avoid it. And yet then these malicious accusations are brought against them. They're dragged in before the king, and they're faced with these two different choices, right? Either we bow down to save our lives, or we choose to honor God and likely forsake our lives. And in the midst of that, there's really two different voices calling out to them, right? The one being fear, right? A fear that demands to be obeyed, a fear that says you should bow down, you should do whatever you have to do to get by, to survive this situation, just do what you have to do. And yet at the same time, they have this other voice calling them to honor God, right? To serve God, to choose to serve God even in the midst of the chaos. And what we see is that even in the midst of the overwhelming fear that they're experiencing, they're still able to choose to follow and honor God. But my question for us this morning, my question for you would be, have you ever felt that fear? Have you ever felt that fear that demands to be listened to, the fear that demands to be paid attention to, a fear that demands obedience? Right? Because there is such a thing as a fear that wants to drive your life. And my question is, if you have felt that, right, then the follow-up would be, in the midst of a fear like that, what helps us? What helps us? There's a song written by the worship band Hillsong United a few years ago that actually pulls directly from this story. Even the title of the song comes from this story. It's called Another in the Fire. And I just want to throw up one of the choruses and just walk through it a little bit, because it ties together a few different biblical stories in a way that I find really fascinating. So this is how they break it down. There was another in the fire standing next to me. That is a reference to this story in particular. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. The second one is there was another in the waters holding back the seas. This is a reference to the book of Exodus, second book in the Bible, when God delivers the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt and takes them across, really through the Red Sea. And then the third story, and should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears the burden where another died for me. The story of, well, really Jesus dying on the cross in our place and for our sins. And I think what's fascinating is that this same theme of fear, right, a fear that demands to be obeyed, is present in every single one of these stories. All right, with the first one, there was another in the fire standing next to me. We've already teased that out quite a bit, right? The fear demands that they bow down in order to save their own lives, right, rather than choosing to serve and honor God. In the second story, there was another in the waters holding back the seas. I think the fear operates a little bit differently there, but in the same vein. And so in that story, the people of Israel were in bondage in Egypt, right? They were being oppressed, mistreated. It was even to the point of genocide, where the Egyptians who were ruling over them were killing their children, their infants. And so in the midst of this, they cried out to God to deliver them, to bring them out into something better, something different. And so God responds by raising up Moses as a leader, sending him to then draw out the people of Israel from Egypt and bring them to something better. Right? And I think the way the fear operates in the midst of this story is the fear would tell them, you need to stay, right? You need to stay in Egypt. Right? Because, yeah, things aren't good here. Yeah, you're being mistreated. Things are painful, but at least it's a pain that's familiar. Because there is no guarantee that things will be better elsewhere. And so fear there demands that you stay. And yet we see that they choose to entrust themselves to God and then pretty quickly get cold feet as Moses leads them out of Egypt and takes them to the banks of the Red Sea. And all of a sudden, they've got nowhere to go in front of them. And from behind them, Pharaoh and his army are bearing down upon them, ready to slaughter them on the spot. And they begin crying out, saying, we never should have left. We never should have left. Why did you take us here? And yet it's in the midst of that situation that God parts the waters of the Red Sea, leads them through on dry ground, and descends as this barrier between them and the Egyptian army, and leads them through without a single hair on their heads ever being touched by Pharaoh or any one of his soldiers. And so we see the same fear in that story, and it operates in a similar way within the first two. But when we get to the third one, the fear works in a slightly different way. Right? The story is a little bit different because in the first two, we are the ones who are afraid. Right? We're the ones who are experiencing the fear. And yet when it comes to the third one, it's something different. Because in the event of Jesus giving his life on the cross, and even in what happened leading up to that, we see that God himself, in the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, we see God entering into the very same fear that we have. As Jesus, the night before his crucifixion, was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was filled with such anxiety that he was sweating drops of blood and pleading with God that if there's any way that this cup can be taken from me, if there's any way that I don't have to do this, I don't want to suffer in this way. I know what's coming tomorrow and I do not want it. If there's any way that we can change this. As he is overwhelmed by this fear that demands to be listened to, that demands to be paid attention to, a fear that demands to be obeyed. And what the fear was demanding of him in that moment was that he alter his course, was that he do something different, that he choose not to die. And yet, even in the midst of that fear, where he finally ends in the prayer, is in saying, but Father, not my will, but let your will be done. All right, and immediately after, he is arrested, and he is taken to trial where he is convicted, right, and he was beaten, and he was tortured, and he was nailed to the cross, and he was lifted up to die in a public and humiliating way, and he was crucified. And he died. Right? Even in the midst of the fear that overwhelms, he chose to give his life for us. And because he did so, now we know, we have the hope and the certainty that every one of the situations we go through in this life, the difficulties, the pain, the experiences that cause us to feel that very same fear, what we know is that one day we will never experience that fear again. Right, and these things will never happen again because he died for us and rose again from that death. And even more than that, what we have to cling to even in this life, while we do continue to experience this fear, right? Because he died and rose again, we have these truths to cling to as well. Matthew 28:20 says, and behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age, that in the midst of everything that we're going through, there is always another in the fire. God is always with us. Hebrews 13:5, I will never leave you nor forsake you, meaning there is nothing you can do to make God abandon you, nothing you can do that's going to cause him to leave you or forsake you in the midst of whatever it is you're going through. In Romans 8:28, for those who love him, all things work together for good, meaning even in the chaos, in the uncertainty, in the pain, God is bringing about good things. Right, he's bringing about wonderful things. Because even in the midst of the chaos, God is always making something beautiful. Now, as we get ready to close here, I want to revisit the story again from the beginning. Right, the story of the boy who and his mother, who every Sunday afternoon they would spend the day with him playing with his toys on the rug in the living room floor, kind of chugging his trains along and building up the blocks and crashing them down. And his mom would sit in her rocking chair and she would cross stitch. And they would spend every Sunday afternoon this way. And every once in a while, the boy would look up from his toys at his mom and he would see the project she was working on and the stitches going this way and that and crossing over each other, a loose thread here and a loose thread there, and all the colors mixing in a way that didn't make any sense to him. It just looked like mess. It just looked like chaos. Until his mom looked up over what she was working on and she saw the puzzled and the quizzical look on her son's face and smiled to herself. And she set aside her project and she knelt down and picked up her son and sat back in the chair and she set him on her lap. And then she picked up her cross-stitching project and she continued to work on it. And all of a sudden, from this new perspective, everything that looked like chaos before, right, the random stitches and the loose threads and the colors going everywhere, everything that looked like chaos, he could see really wasn't chaos at all. But he could see how every stitch, how every thread, how every color, how every movement his mom had been making had been working together to make something wonderful, something beautiful. And in the same way, at the end of our lives, right, and at the end of time, when we sit down beside our Savior and we look back on every experience of this life that involved this chaos and the pain and the uncertainty and the fear that overwhelms, that didn't make sense to us. What we'll see is that in every one of those situations, God was working, using every stitch, every thread, every color, every movement to make something beautiful. Because even in the midst of the chaos, God is always making something beautiful. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we thank you for the time together this morning. It is a gift even just to be together. So we thank you for your word. We thank you for the ways that you are with us in our own fear. We thank you for the ways that you calm us and bring us peace in the midst of those. And even as we persist in the fear, that it's okay for us to feel those things, that you yourself felt them and you allowed yourself to feel them. And so I thank you for the way that you modeled that for us. And at the same time, I thank you for the ways that you continue to be with us always, in the fire, in the waters, in the chaos, and in the fear. And that because of what you've done, one day that fear will be no more. So we thank you and we praise you for that. In your precious name, amen.